Yes. All right, very exciting. All right, so it's 11:03. So welcome, Brother Lawrence Grandpre from the leaders of a beautiful struggle, not leaders of an ugly struggle, not leaders of a difficult struggle, but of a beautiful struggle. Most people became familiar with Baltimore. I shouldn't say most, but many people became familiar with Baltimore from the show The Wire, about the things that were going on. A lot of people became more familiar with Baltimore from the recent rebellion. I think it's been 2 or 3 years now since that happened. But it says on your website, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle is a think tank. So school us real quick, man, on what this think tank is and give us an understanding about the work that you all do in Baltimore, Maryland.
Well, thank you for having me. The term think tank reflects our beginnings. Many of the members of the executive team of LBS, we go by our initials, were competing in high school and college policy debate. Now, debate is like an academic sport. It's very competitive. You travel all over the country. You debate these research-intensive topics of national policy. And this community was very elite. It was very abstract. And a lot of the people who come out of this community go on to work in Washington, D.C. think tanks and help shape the policy of the country for better or worse. But there was a movement of Black debaters and Black elders in this space to use debate essentially as a training ground for young Black students to use an understanding of racism and white supremacy as a lens to develop emancipatory thinking around policymaking. So we had great success in that community, both as competitors and coaches. One thing that I like to point out is before 2008, there was one Black college debate national champion. And this is a 2-person debate team activity. After 2008, including our director of public policy, Davon Love, was one half of the first all-Black debate team to win a college debate national championship at Hudson University, where many of us attended or coached debate. There have been 16 Black college debate national champions, and 6 of them are from Baltimore. So that's just college. So this debate community is an intellectual crucible that helped form why we chose to be a think tank, because we understood that the right, the conservatives, have used this model of thought leadership and think tanks really for the past 40 years to help dominate political conversations in Washington, D.C. There are some statistics that say about 70% of the bills passed by Reagan and the Reagan Republicans in the 80s were written by the Conservative Heritage Foundation, a very prominent D.C. think tank. And while there are liberals and sort of corporate Democrats trying to counter the hegemony and the tactics of the right, there was no one doing anything like that for poor Black people. So we chose to use this framework of a think tank to really kind of define our lane, our piece of what we see as the Black radical struggle, the Black radical tradition, which really is this policy piece, which is one part of a larger ecosystem of Black people on the move, Black community work that we want to we see ourselves as plugged into, which is very different than most other think tanks.
Man, that's beautiful. Racial justice now, we work around organizing, advocacy, and policy. So we do know that there is a strong need for what you described as thought leadership. Those that do the reports, that draw from historical context and analyze data, as we say in our tradition of Sankofa, go back and fetch the history and to bring it up to today, to make today's modern day and time and use it so that we can be successful in representing our interests. So I thank you all for that. Tell us a little bit more, Brother Lawrence, about the work that you've been doing locally, regionally, statewide, and some of the wins that you've put up on the scoreboard outside of bringing them trophies home, on the debate team. And I certainly appreciate that. We're going to have to talk more about that debate topic. But yeah, please tell us more about your work regionally, locally, and statewide.
Yes. Many of us on the executive leadership team are in our late 20s, early 30s, but we went off Towson University's campus. It was previously a campus organization. So we went off campus and into the community really in 2009. So we really have about a decade of work under our belt. And some examples of some of the campaigns that we've been a part of are, there was a push by the Democratic governor of Maryland, Martin O'Malley, to construct an entire jail only for youth who have been charged as adults. So this is basically a $113 million jail that basically would criminalize youth, would assume they're going to commit violent crimes, and would lock the state in to a mentality of incarcerating youth if they've been convicted of violent crimes, as opposed to treating them like children and giving them rehabilitation and alternative services. You hear that siren in the background?
Yes, take your time.
Okay. Yeah, so you can just mark this, and I'll just wait until it stops wailing. Okay, so I'll pick back up. So we were part of a coalition that resisted the construction of this youth jail, and we were actually successful in getting that facility canceled in terms of its construction. We started working on police accountability in 2013. So before Ferguson, before Mike Brown, there was Christopher Brown, a young Black man who was killed in Baltimore County. And we were going around the community events just talking to people about the landscape, and we met Christopher Brown's mother, who wanted a bill passed in remembrance of her son. So this bill was a very simple bill that focused on training for police in engagements where an individual seems to have some sort of mental distress. And we were able to get that bill successfully passed in 2013. So we began to realize that Baltimore, though it is the largest city in Maryland, a lot of the power wasn't quite in City Hall, like a lot of people I think typically think. It was in the state capital of Annapolis, which is about 40 minutes down the street south of Baltimore. So we began really in 2013 to try to specialize and focus on state house advocacy around issues of racial justice. So that led us into bigger police accountability fights in 2015 around fundamentally challenging the Fraternal Order of Police, the police unions, and their stranglehold over any basic semblance of police accountability in Maryland. It's almost impossible to fire a cop in Maryland because of the ways that the union has structured the laws. And the Maryland General Assembly actually rejected our proposed police accountability reforms just a week before Freddie Gray was arrested. So literally a week before Freddie Gray was arrested, we had been in Annapolis lobbying the lawmakers to change these laws, and they told us, no, we're not interested. So that really put us in a position to be one of the grassroots groups who was seen as having credibility on the issue of police accountability. So we were intricately involved in all of the machinations around what we call the Baltimore Uprising in 2015. My feet start to hurt just thinking about, all the protests, all the marches, all the tumult that happened in the light of the uprising. And that really put us in a position where people couldn't ignore us. We're not a nonprofit. We're a grassroots organization that does a fee-for-service model in terms of funding and crowdfunding in terms of our economic model. So it really positions us as a challenge to institutional advocacy organizations, institutional nonprofits, institutional philanthropy, where they can't take certain stances because they depend on their relationships and they're accountable to what's usually a very corporate board. So we've really positioned ourselves to be able to say the things other people can't say. We are positioned to directly engage the Democratic establishment in the state of Maryland, where the Democratic Party has a stranglehold on political power, despite having a Republican governor. If I can just give one example of the type of fights that we take on and have fortunately been able to win more than we lose, quite frankly, even despite long odds. Maryland was the number 3 state in the country in terms of money produced by the bail bonds industry. Despite having a low population compared to Texas or Florida, Maryland was the #3 state in terms of revenue produced by bail bondsmen. It is a rapacious, capitalistic leech sucking out the Black community because they're literally charging you for your right to get out of jail, even though you've been convicted of no crime. So there was a court ruling that said that the way we do bail in Maryland was unconstitutional. Basically, you were locking people up just because they're poor, which is against the law, right? The bail bondsmen put on a full court press to essentially pass legislation which overturned this court ruling. We hadn't seen anything quite like it. There was lobbyists literally all over the state capitol. There were dinners at Ruth's Chris Steakhouse that we actually crashed. And we actually bought a table at Ruth's Chris Steakhouse and staked out the lawmakers as they were being wined and dined by the bail bondsmen. There were, and this is the part that's important, the bail bondsmen produced essentially a fake bill that looked like reform, but in reality just repealed the court ruling and allowed them to continue to exploit our community. And they were successfully able to recruit the state urban league, the local urban league of Baltimore, the state NAACP, and the National Southern Christian Leadership Council, Martin Luther King's organization. They flew in the current head of the SCLC to testify in favor of their fake bill. So this is whole-scale co-option of the civil rights legacy. This is whole-scale co-option of really the Black Caucus, the Democratic Party Black Caucus in Maryland, all in the name of supporting an exploitative industry. And we had lawmakers saying things like, hey, I support the bail bondsman because it's an industry open to minority participation. You know, so this is the level of confusion that the Democratic Party gets locked in, but it becomes really hard to push back against them because most advocacy organizations can't outright run an electoral campaign against these people because nonprofits aren't supposed to do electoral advocacy. They can, of course, do policy consciousness raising and they can do public awareness around policy, but you can't actually put someone out of office. We can. And quite frankly, we've made it very clear to lawmakers that make sure they know that. So we were actually able to defeat the bail bonds industry. So the court ruling stood. It wasn't a perfect court ruling, but this is a multi-million-dollar industry that was defeated by this coalition of grassroots activists and criminal justice advocates. And that really, I think, changed our perception statewide in terms of really being able to fight back against business as usual here in Maryland and really be able to push back against the ways in which social justice is co-opted.
Man, thank you for that example. That's an excellent and informative example. One of the things that makes Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle different is based around the model. You can say possibly the framework might be another way to put it. But you mentioned radical, finish my sentence there.
We use the term Black radical tradition.
Black radical tradition. And you also mentioned the term nationalism on your website. So if you can kind of give us a little more in depth about nationalism and the radical traditions that you draw from to really make up the format or the foundation of LBS, that'd be very helpful.
No problem. And this is really important, so thank you for asking this question. So the world of academic debate is essentially a very academic world, no surprise. So there are lots of series of political science. There's also a lot of sort of European political theory, very academic series of feminism and sort of anti-capitalism. So we all got exposed to all of that. But as working class people from Baltimore, Maryland, working class Black people, we also understood that there is an intellectual tradition that, quite frankly, has been excluded and exercised from the academy. There is a long history of scholars that use what we call African-centered thought. Some people call it Afrocentrism. We don't necessarily like that term because that's a particular serious and a particular way of thinking about it. But essentially the cultural and intellectual resources of African people that do not essentially directly mimic what other white people are saying, basically, what other Eurocentric scholars are saying, has been excluded in terms of a resource to think about politics, to think about policy, and to think about community organizing. So we call ourselves an organization that focuses on Pan-African nationalism, Pan-African solidarity, and building self-determination for Black people. So that's really a long tradition of Black folks who worked in the community control movements of the 60s and 70s, Black folks who've worked in the reparations movement, you know, all the way from Queen Mother Aubrey Moore in the early 20th century to the reparations movement today, folks like Cobra, folks who worked with CORE, folks who worked with the Black Panthers. These are folks who we really see as our mentors. And this is a particular strain of Black thought, which quite frankly have not been studied or focused on a lot in the academy. So in addition to, you know, very academic training in terms of political science and political theory, we really see our intellectual and political methodology stemming from the lessons we've learned from Black organizing and Black policy advocacy throughout Black history, and a theory of community self-determination, which is very different than a lot of the social justice policy making and policy advocacy that typically comes up in many nonprofit advocacy spaces. So just one quick example, when the city of Baltimore, another siren.
No problem.
I'll get to the example as soon as the siren goes by. Yeah, the firehouse down the street from us is apparently the most active firehouse in the country.
Nice. For you, huh?
Island Central.
Damn.
Is the audio coming through okay?
So far, so good.
Okay. All right,
Yeah.
so I'll just pick back up. So one example of our methodology in practice is the Baltimore City Children and Youth Fund. The city had to do something in response to the Baltimore uprising of 2015. So then City Councilman Jack Young, City Council President, he has since been elevated to mayor, basically pushed for a charter amendment to the Constitution of the City of Baltimore, whereby essentially 3% of all property tax revenue would go into a locked box only for services for children and youth. So the typical question that we asked, because we have a vision of Black self-determination, is who's going to manage this money? Who's going to choose who gets funded? Because typically people say fund the youth. That's a good thing in general. But when you have an understanding of the Black radical tradition, you understand that these nonprofit services has often served as a mechanism of control over the community and a mechanism to empower people who are not steeped in the culture of the community to do programming that doesn't reflect the desires of the community. One very popular nonprofit here in Baltimore is Symphony Kids, where they teach Black kids to play the violin, you know, and things like that get funded all the time. But we've had trouble getting African Rites of Passage funded in terms of the foundation sector. Right, and our Black elders throughout history have talked about the different politics of who gets funded and who doesn't in Baltimore. And we were determined to basically make sure this youth fund did not replicate the nonprofit industrial complex in Baltimore. Right. So a very prominent nonprofit in Baltimore brought in another nonprofit from Boston, basically saying, this is how we're going to do the youth fund. And we talked to our people, we looked at what they were presenting, and we found it pretty problematic. Their vision of participatory budgeting was basically putting stuff online and letting people vote. And we realized that that just basically rewards the nonprofits who have the most money because they can do the best social media advocacy for whatever thing they were presenting. So it wasn't really participatory. It was basically allowing the same big nonprofits to get more money, but to make it look participatory. So we said, we think this model is wrong. We don't think people from Boston need to design our youth fund. We think we should design it ourselves. And what we did was our CEO was appointed the head of a task force that produced recommendations that said that the youth fund should focus on building capacity for indigenous community-led organizations who typically don't get funded through the existing channels. And we actually paid a team of people from the community to review all the grant proposals and rank them, and using a racial equity lens. And that's actually how this $10 million of money was given out. So we have things like Revolutionary Summer, which is a Black feminist radical summer camp that was funded. We have a Black barbering apprenticeship program that was funded because the community people who reviewed the grants deemed these programs things that they wanted to be in their community. These are things that typically don't happen when the power to invest the money and to make these choices are in the hands of people who aren't from our community. Needless to say, there's been a lot of pushback against this youth fund. There's been a lot of controversy and misinformation around it. But the reality is that these people from community reviewed hundreds of grant applications and they had the power to choose who got funded. And that's scary to a lot of people who are used to having power. But that's the type of political advocacy that's needed to actually shift power in our communities.
Man, you're using some powerful, no pun, some powerful words there. Really talking about power in our communities, power over local resources, power over local government. You mentioned something important, and you just kind of breezed by it, but you said your CEO was appointed to a task force position, which just shows the level of power, of the organization in the community. So I'm thankful to have Brother Lawrence Grandpre on with the LBS, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle from Baltimore, Maryland, a think tank, an unusual occurrence, an unusual creation in the Black community. So these are thought leaders in our community that we're looking for guidance, for help, for assistance, and particularly thought leadership around policy and advocacy. And so, Brother Lawrence, we've been dialoguing about our concern here at Racial Justice Now about a national phenomenon we see happening with this thing called a behavioral threat assessment. Now, we do know that white children have had a bad habit of going into crowded places and shooting it up, killing a whole bunch of people, injuring a whole bunch of people, and it's becoming more and more prevalent in our communities. We do know that this is not happening in the Black community. This is not happening in Baltimore, that there's guns violence in Baltimore, but still nobody's going in and shooting up mass shootings in the schools. But due to these shootings, there's been many school safety conversations happening around the country, a lot of policy changes. And quite honestly, what I see and what makes me nervous, knowing the history of the police, Brother Lawrence, is that this becomes an opportunity for people in power, in Congress, in Senate, and other seats of local and statewide power to give a stimulus package to poor whites. Now, this is what happened in the 1700s when elite whites who were slave owners, who were enslaving Africans against their will, they would hire poor whites as slave catchers to monitor those that were enslaved in the event that they ran away. Those same slave catchers later became the police force. So hundreds of years later, fast forward to today, or fast forward to the last couple of decades, we can't leave out the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, also known as the FBI, and the quite honestly, the criminal J. Edgar Hoover that headed up the FBI, who created a COINTEL program. And this COINTEL program was strictly to stop the rise of a Black Messiah. Isn't that something? They were looking out for leadership in the Black community to find out who that one was, and then they would take them out. So they murdered, they committed sabotage, they sent in spies, they did all that they could to disrupt Black organizations. And a part of doing that was collecting information on the mass population, spying on the mass population in our communities, being snoopers, being nosy, just being in other people's business, right? They have a tendency to kind of follow that track record. But in modern day and time, now there's a new program, this behavioral threat assessment, where a SRO, a school resource officer, who is trained by the police and is many ways considered a special police with jurisdiction and ability to arrest. Anywhere I go incorrect, please correct me so we can make sure that we're 100% telling the truth and not veering off from what our children have to endure in school, not in the streets, but where they're supposed to be learning. So there's an SRO, a military person, a police officer, which used to be a slave catcher, right? So this same mentality coming to today is in our schools. And along with a teacher or a staff person from the school, they will be looking over the children to see which one is a, quote, threat. So now this label, my grandmother told me, she said she's old enough to have been called a nigger, to have been called colored, to have called Negro, to have called African-American, Afro-American, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in this instance, what they're going to start calling our children is a threat. Now, that's a label that they're putting on a child, a threat, not a student athlete, but a threat. So we're not allowing them to have this power. We are going to be combating this power. And so please, Brother Lawrence, with all of that said, just give us some insight on what's happening in Maryland, about what you see with this behavioral threat assessment. I didn't even get into the predictive analytics that's surrounding it, but let's just start there with the behavioral threat assessment.
So there are a lot of things to break down there.
Yeah.
I'll give a few examples based upon my experience as a debate coach and my experience doing policy advocacy. So as I said, one of our biggest fights was against the bail bond industry. And they, advocates on our side, actually proposed what they saw as a progressive social justice solution, which is have a objective computer program determine what people are a threat to community and should not be given the choice of pretrial release, and what people aren't a threat to community. So they thought they were helping. This is a long history of liberals basically correctly recognizing that judges do have racial bias, but basically offering up solutions that replicate the problem. So when you actually look at the threat assessments for pretrial justice, and I fear this would happen with a school threat assessment as well, there are lots of things that look neutral, look natural, but are actually really proxies for race and racism. So look at previous engagements with the criminal justice system. So that's the type of thing they look at with pretrial justice assessments. I imagine the same thing would happen with school. We know that, for example, Black people and white people smoke weed and use drugs at the same rate. But Black people are massively over-policed when it comes to especially public use of things like marijuana. So if you're just on the corner and somebody smokes a joint, that happens with white kids all the time. They don't get arrested. Our Black kids do get arrested because of the nature of racism. And that gets put in not only to your criminal justice report, but now in your school report to determine if you're a quote unquote threat. So that's just one example. Another example, and this is where culture becomes really important. Because when we say African-centered policy advocacy, people say, what does that mean? How is that possible? What does it look like? Let me give you an example that applies to your question. People of African descent, and not to essentialize, they're very different, have been known to have atypical non-nuclear family structures. That's a manifestation of slavery, but also a manifestation of African culture. So you may live with your quote unquote cousin that you have no real blood relation to. Right. But as we know, with African people, that might be a stronger bond than your actual blood relationships.
Yeah.
A so-called objective threat assessment has no way to understand that relationship. So in the threat assessments that they actually use in real life for pretrial justice, the question is, do you have secure housing? And secure housing is only seen if you pay your own rent or if you live with your nuclear family. So any arrangement of family relationships that isn't a nuclear family are deemed as a threat. You are unstable. You are therefore more likely to be deviant. And that is something that is directly opposed to African people's historic culture.
Yes.
So that's just one very practical understanding of how an understanding of African culture challenges basic assumptions on policymaking, and specifically within the context of your threat assessment model. I'll give you one more example.
Okay.
When I say I coach debate, this is a very intensive activity. It's 20, 30 hours a week. And part of the turn towards Black scholarship has been radical scholarship. So a lot of our students, we actually had a 3-week summer debate camp for 5 years. We called it the Eddie Conway Liberation Institute, named after a wrongfully imprisoned Black Panther here in Baltimore. Taught young people how to use radical Black political thought in debate. So one thing I realized is that our metrics for success with our youth were very different than the typical metrics of what most nonprofits see as success. So for example, if you are quiet, always looking at your notes, that is typically seen as being focused and studious within a typical pedagogical relationship. Our students are more combative. They've been known to talk back. And in fact, after they come from our debate camp, they may talk back even more when the teacher is saying something they disagree with. Some people would view that as a manifestation of them becoming a threat. They are disorderly, they are resistive. We view that not only not as a threat, but as positive. Because actually being willing to engage in a back and forth with the teacher both shows a basic level of respect. If you don't respect somebody, you don't even talk to them. So if you actually speak up, you have some basic respect, but also they're willing to assert their agency in a positive, proactive way. So this whole idea of resistance for us as Black folks in the Black radical tradition, that is a pro-social behavior. In a world of oppression, resistance and critical thinking and questioning authority is a pro-social behavior. But in this threat assessment, I fear that those type of performances of Black identity will be deemed antisocial behavior, right? So at a very basic level, you can see the fundamental schisms that allow for, because what they would say is, and I imagine this is what they will say, look, we know it's not perfect, but think about what's happening right now. Black kids are getting expelled. These principles are racist. We all know it. So we need some basic criteria that is neutral to be able to decide who's a threat and who isn't. But there is no neutral criteria when the world itself is imbued with these racist power relations. Like, we give kids Fanon, Frantz Fanon to read. And basically all of our debate kids have read Fanon in one way, shape, or form. That's something very easy to demonize when you come from a typical Eurocentric perspective. You're reading a terrorist. You know, Frantz Fanon, of course, was an Algerian freedom fighter who fought against the colonial regime of France that was trying to colonize the African country that we now know as Algeria. And he wrote a lot about the psychology of liberation, the psychology of whiteness and white supremacy, internalized oppression, a lot of stuff that's really important for young people to read as part of their intellectual and human development. But if you view stuff like that as, oh, you're making kids angry, you're turning them into threats, that's the way in which I fear this sort of threat assessment culture can lead to more surveillance of kids' social media, can lead to more surveillance of kids' public speech, and basic expressions of useful resistance to authority get deemed as inappropriate manifestations of them becoming threats. So I think that there's a lot to unpack, there's a lot of advocacy to happen there, but those very specific examples, I think, help push back against some of the ways in which, again, these people who see themselves as good liberals, potentially good colorblind liberals who think they're helping, ways to push back against the ways in which these policies are going to be advocated for and proposed in your community.
Powerful, thank you. Now, we mentioned the behavioral threat assessment, and right hand in hand with the threat assessment is the predictive or data analytics. More people are getting familiar that their data is being captured and shared, that their data is being sold, that they're the things that they click on, the things that they like, the things that they buy, all of this is becoming very valuable data or information. Some say that it's more valuable than a barrel of oil on the market in exchange for dollars and cents. So with this data analytics, this is one thing that we're very concerned about in the context of behavioral threat assessments. You know, who is going to get this information? You know, will a child that's considered a threat now, will they not be able to take, AP classes? Will they no longer be able to apply to certain high schools or trade schools because of this label that's been put on them? Will this information be shared with ICE and other federal bureaus to, follow this child where they go at their home or at the grocery store, at the laundromat? Will the police and the sheriff's department receive this same information? We're talking about SROs that are trained by the police to do these threat assessments. And so we're very concerned about how this information is going to be shared, who's going to have access to this information, who it'll be sent to, and for what reasons. So please, Brother Lawrence, fill us in on some of your experience with these data analytics and these predictive analytics.
Another great question. Again, it's something that I talked about a little bit in the previous answer, and it's something that is very close to my heart. Another siren. All right, so give me 1 minute while the siren goes by.
And so this will be this is the last question, and then after it, I'll follow up with contact information, ways to support, and all that kind of thing. Did you follow that?
It's heading down the street. It'll be out in a little bit. So one thing I'm trying to remind myself to do is when I finish my answers, I'm going to hit mute on my mic so you don't pick up any of the background noise.
So this is the last question.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm gonna go to the tell everybody how to contact you, information.
Gotcha. All right, that should be better. Um, sorry, I'm gonna make this real quick. Okay, you ready?
Yes.
Okay, so we have some experience with these predictive analytics. They, again, replicate this. It's an illusion. And here's how the illusion works, since otherwise smart people fall into it. Because of the history of racism, we have done certain things like over police communities. When we lock people up, that disrupts the community, which means that people then don't have an alternative to the street economy, which we then criminalize. But when you use the data, it just looks like there are certain things that are objectively true. Like there are objectively neighborhoods where there is more crime happening. And that's not true. As we've talked about, the levels of crime between black communities and white communities, when you adjust for socioeconomics, are roughly similar. But because black communities are so heavily over policed, it just looks like black folks are committing all this crime. So people use this data and then they say, well, there are certain patterns of behavior that are red flags. For example, in the context of schools, you may look at attendance or tardiness as a metric for a potential threat. Now we know, especially for black folks, if they like have to go to charter schools, they have to be on the bus really late at night and really early in the morning. So it's really hard for them to get to school. And they also are probably dealing with increased commutes, increased social disruption because of the nature of how many black people are forced to live. If your mother has to work the night shift for you to be able to survive, as what happens in many people who work service economy jobs, there's just going to be greater disruption, greater family disruption that's specifically impacting the black community because they're more in the service economy and less in the professional knowledge economy. So all of that gets washed away. All that context gets washed away. And all you see is kids that come late somehow are a threat. It's a reflection of the disruption caused by racism and white supremacy. But the trick is you individualize it as what's happening with this one kid, this one student who is coming tardy more often, and they become the problem to be solved, as opposed to understanding the conditions around the data. Because data itself, the value of it is entirely downstream from the frame you use to interpret it. So there's lots of data that is useful. I know one thing, because we're actually going through this in Baltimore. They want to combine the data systems from multiple different agencies. And I'm one of the folks who is challenging them because it's my concern is similar to yours, that if you incorporate criminal justice data with the school systems data, you're basically just going to have more data points on which to make racist or incorrect inferences, as opposed to actually using the data to understand the structure of power and change it. One last example. This is something I thought was true, but apparently the data in Baltimore backs this up. The number one disruption, the number one source of disruption for students is when they have to change schools. So the biggest points of dropouts, and I would infer some of the biggest points of like violence and quote unquote threat, is when a student leaves one school and comes to another school. They're the new kid, they have no existing social connections. It's the classic sitcom story. The new kid gets in a fight, right? But think about all of the socioeconomic factors that go into having to change schools. If you get evicted, you have to change schools. If someone in your family who is helping you pay rent goes to jail, that's when you often have to change schools. If you lose your job, that's when you have to change schools. So all of this socioeconomic churn that's disproportionately impacting Black people, I fear it's going to be localized and individual students being seen as threats. Now, what we could do is use that data to target positive resources to people who are experiencing a social economic disruption. But because of racism, white supremacy, what I fear your organization is talking about and potentially will see is the nature of Black people being seen as threats will overwhelm the way in which this data could be interpreted to target resources to our most needy youth. It will be used to say, you got to keep an eye on that kid. Our numbers are saying that they're potentially going to be a threat. And I know this specifically because literally the people we used to debate against work for these threat assessment companies. So I go to my Facebook page and I literally see that woman from Northwestern University who we debated in 2012 works for Palantir, a company that does this data acquisition and data analysis.
Wow.
So this is the world that we come from. This is the value of our debate experience, is that we were there when these people were trying to use this methodology to beat us in debate. So we were able to break apart some of the assumptive logic behind it. And it's that experience that we carry into our advocacy today.
Man, this has been a powerful dialogue here with Brother Lawrence Grandpre from LBS, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, out of Baltimore, Maryland. We've been digging deep into the work of LBS, what's going on in Baltimore and what's going on throughout Maryland. We've been digging deep into this new COINTEL program, or COINTEL-like program, the behavioral threat assessment, and also data and predictive analytics that have come along with it. So I know you've been in for a treat. You're probably gonna want to rewind that, listen to it again, take some notes. This brother dropped some jewels that you want to go back and pick up. They're too valuable, too expensive, not for you to have picked them up. So Brother Lawrence, tell the people, the good listeners out here, how they can get in contact with you, how they can follow you, how they can learn more information, and how they can possibly be to benefit and help the work that you're doing.
Thank you. So we have two websites. One is our organizational website. That's lbsbaltimore.com. And that just has who we are, our methodology, analysis of some of our advocacy campaigns. We have a new website, and as the director of research, I'm actually helping to spearhead this new venture. We're calling it New Timbuktu. This is the centralization of all of our knowledge production. So we have two books. We have a podcast series, a podcast called In Search of Black Power. You can find it on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcast, and Stitcher. And we are basically using this as our platform to help spread the knowledge economy, spread the word about our policy lens. Again, we're not a nonprofit, so we depend on monthly contributions from people who like our work and people supporting us by buying our books and helping us out in general. So again, that's newtimbuktu.com for our knowledge production work, the podcast In Search of Black Power, our two books, and lbsbaltimore.com. You can also find us on Facebook at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and on Twitter at LBS Baltimore.
Awesome, man. Thank you, Brother Lawrence, for your time. Wishing you and the LBS family peace and blessings.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.